The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as 72-year-old Harold Mitchell made his way slowly toward the main entrance. His weathered hands gripped his walking cane tightly, each step deliberate and careful. The medals on his chest caught the light as they swayed gently with his movement. Today marked the 50th anniversary of his military service, and he had been invited to attend a special ceremony honoring veterans at the royal palace. Harold had served in 3 different conflicts during his career, earning numerous commendations for bravery and leadership. His uniform, though decades old, still fit him well, pressed to perfection for this momentous occasion. He had spent the previous evening polishing each medal, remembering the circumstances that had earned him each one. The memories were bittersweet, filled with both pride and the weight of experiences that had shaped his entire life. As he approached the palace steps, Harold noticed the impressive sight of the royal guards standing at attention. Their red tunics and tall black hats created a striking display of ceremonial tradition. He had always admired the discipline and dedication required for such service, understanding the commitment it took to maintain such standards day after day. The elderly veteran paused at the bottom of the stone steps, looking up at the imposing entrance. The steps seemed steeper than he had expected, and he felt a momentary concern about navigating them safely. His left leg had been giving him trouble lately, a lingering reminder of an old war injury that had never quite healed properly. Still, he was determined to make it to the ceremony that would honor his decades of service to his country. Other guests were arriving for the event, some in military dress uniforms, others in formal civilian attire. Harold recognized a few faces from his old regiment, men he had served alongside many years ago. The sight of familiar faces brought a smile to his weathered features, reminding him of the brotherhood that had sustained him through difficult times. Taking a deep breath, Harold began his ascent up the palace steps. The first few steps went smoothly, his cane providing steady support as he climbed. He maintained his military bearing, shoulders straight and head held high despite the physical challenges he faced. The sound of his cane tapping against the stone created a steady rhythm that seemed to echo in the courtyard. Halfway up the steps, Harold felt his left leg begin to weaken. The old injury was acting up more than usual, possibly due to the stress of the occasion or the cool morning air. He paused briefly, adjusting his grip on his cane and taking a moment to steady himself. Looking up, he could see that he still had several more steps to climb before reaching the entrance. A group of younger veterans passed by him, their movements quick and confident. Harold didn't feel envious, but rather proud to see the next generation of service members maintaining the traditions he had helped establish. Their respectful nods as they passed showed that they recognized his service and understood the significance of his presence at the ceremony. As Harold continued climbing, his breathing became slightly labored. The combination of his age, the physical exertion, and the emotional weight of the day was taking its toll. He gripped the stone railing more firmly, using it to help support his weight as he navigated each step. The medals on his chest seemed heavier now, each one representing not just an honor but also the physical and emotional cost of his service. Near the top of the steps, Harold's left leg suddenly gave way. The weakness he had been fighting all morning finally overcame his determination and careful movements. His cane slipped on the smooth stone and he felt himself losing balance. Time seemed to slow as he realized he was falling backward down the steps he had worked so hard to climb. The distinguished veteran tumbled down several steps before coming to rest on the cold stone. His cane clattered away from him, the sound echoing sharply in the morning air. His carefully pressed uniform was now wrinkled and dusty, and his medals lay scattered around him. The fall had happened so quickly that nearby guests initially didn't realize what had occurred. Harold lay still for a moment, trying to assess his condition. His left shoulder ached where it had struck the stone, and he could feel a sharp pain in his hip. More than the physical discomfort, however, was the overwhelming sense of embarrassment and vulnerability. Here he was, a decorated veteran who had faced enemy fire without flinching, helpless on the palace steps in front of other ceremony attendees. The sound of footsteps approaching made Harold look up. Several people had noticed his fall and were hurrying toward him, expressions of concern visible on their faces. He tried to push himself up with his right arm, but the effort sent a sharp pain through his shoulder that made him gasp. The realization that he might be seriously injured began to sink in. Among those, Approaching was a tall figure in the distinctive red tunic and black hat of the Royal Guard. The guard's face was young but serious, his expression focused entirely on Harold's welfare. Unlike the ceremonial stillness typically associated with the Royal Guard, this guard moved with purpose and urgency, his training evident in every step. Harold felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him as more people gathered around. This was supposed to be his day of honor, a celebration of his service and sacrifice. Instead, he found himself helpless on the ground, requiring assistance from others. The irony was not lost on him that he who had helped so many others during his military career now found himself in desperate need of help. The approaching Royal Guard reached Harold first, immediately dropping to one knee beside the fallen veteran. The guard's movements were swift but careful, his eyes quickly assessing Harold's condition while maintaining a respectful demeanor. This moment would prove to be the beginning of something extraordinary, though neither man could have predicted the significance of what was about to unfold. As Harold looked up into the young guard's face, he saw something unexpected. Rather than the detached professionalism he might have expected, there was genuine concern and compassion in the guard's eyes. It was clear that this was not just another duty to be performed, but a moment that called for something more human and personal than mere protocol would dictate. The Royal Guard's name was Thomas Anderson, and he was 26 years old. He had been serving in the elite unit for 3 years, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, who had also been a Royal Guard decades earlier. Thomas took immense pride in his position, understanding the weight of tradition and responsibility that came with wearing the distinctive uniform. Every day he maintained the highest standards of discipline and protocol that the role demanded. As Thomas knelt beside Harold, his mind raced through his training. The Royal Guard manual was clear about maintaining position and following proper channels for any incidents that occurred during ceremonial duties. Protocol dictated that he should alert his superior officer and allow the appropriate medical personnel to handle the situation. However, looking at the elderly veteran's pained expression and obvious distress, Thomas felt a conflict between his duty and his conscience. Harold attempted to speak, his voice shaky from both pain and embarrassment. "I'm sorry for causing such a disturbance," he whispered to Thomas. "I just wanted to make it to the ceremony. Today marks 50 years since I first put on a uniform." The vulnerability in the old man's voice struck Thomas deeply. Here was someone who had dedicated his life to serving others, now lying helpless and apologizing for needing assistance. Thomas noticed the medals scattered around Harold, recognizing several distinguished service awards that spoke to the veteran's exceptional military career. The Military Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, and campaign medals from multiple conflicts painted a picture of a man who had faced extraordinary challenges with courage and honor. The sight of these symbols of service lying dusty on the palace steps seemed almost sacrilegious to Thomas. Other guards had noticed the situation and were beginning to approach, along with several palace officials. Thomas could see his commanding officer making his way through the gathering crowd, and he knew that standard procedure would soon take over. The veteran would be handed off to medical personnel, and Thomas would be expected to return to his post as if nothing had happened. The thought of walking away from this man troubled him deeply. Harold tried again to push himself up, but the pain in his shoulder and hip made it impossible. His face contorted with the effort, and Thomas could see that the fall had likely caused more serious injury than initially apparent. The elderly man's breathing was becoming more labored, and a thin sheen of perspiration had formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Please don't move, sir," Thomas said gently, his voice carrying the respect he felt for the veteran's service. "Help is on the way." But even as he spoke these words, Thomas realized that following standard protocol felt inadequate given the circumstances. This wasn't just any person who had fallen. This was a decorated veteran who had given his best years in service to his country. The crowd around them was growing larger, with ceremony guests stopping to see what had happened. Thomas could hear whispered conversations and the clicking of camera phones as people documented the scene. The thought of Harold's dignity being further compromised by becoming a spectacle for curious onlookers motivated Thomas to take action beyond what his training prescribed, making a decision that would later be scrutinized by his superiors. Thomas carefully removed his ceremonial jacket and draped it over Harold's legs for warmth and dignity. The action was small but significant, representing a departure from the rigid formality expected of the Royal Guard. Thomas then positioned himself to shield Harold from the view of the gathering crowd, using his body as a barrier to protect the veteran's privacy. Harold's eyes widened with surprise at this gesture of compassion. In his 50 years of military service, he had encountered many different types of soldiers and officers. Some were rule followers who never deviated from protocol, while others understood that true leadership sometimes required making difficult decisions in the moment. Thomas was clearly in the latter category, and Harold recognized the moral courage it took to prioritize human dignity over strict adherence to procedure. "What's your name, son?" Harold asked, his voice slightly stronger now that he felt less exposed and vulnerable. Thomas hesitated for a moment, knowing that personal interaction with ceremony guests was generally discouraged during official duties. However, the circumstances seemed to call for a more human approach than military protocol typically allowed. "Thomas Anderson, sir," he replied, maintaining his protective position beside the fallen veteran. "I served with the Army before joining the Royal Guard. My grandfather used to tell me stories about veterans like yourself, men who paved the way for all of us who came after." This personal connection seemed to comfort Harold, who managed a weak smile despite his pain. The palace medical team had been summoned and was making their way through the crowd with a stretcher and emergency equipment. Thomas knew that his window for making a difference in this situation was rapidly closing. Once the medical professionals took over, he would be expected to return to his ceremonial duties and maintain the stoic demeanor required of his position. But Thomas found himself unwilling to simply walk away from Harold. The veteran's courage in attempting to attend the ceremony, despite his obvious physical limitations, deserved more than just professional medical attention. It deserved recognition and respect from someone who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Thomas's commanding officer finally reached the scene, his expression stern as he took in the situation. Captain Morrison was a career military man who valued discipline and order above all else. He had little patience for guards who deviated from established protocols, regardless of the circumstances. Thomas could see the disapproval in his superior's eyes and knew that questions would be asked about his actions. "Anderson, return to your post," Captain Morrison ordered curtly. "The medical team will handle this situation." The command was clear and direct, leaving no room for interpretation or discussion. Thomas was expected to obey immediately and without question, as he had been trained to do throughout his military career. However, as Thomas looked down at Harold, he saw something in the veteran's eyes that changed everything. It wasn't gratitude or expectation, but rather a quiet understanding that sometimes doing the right thing required personal risk. Harold had clearly faced similar moments during his own service, times when following orders conflicted with moral conviction. Thomas made a decision that would define not only the rest of this day, but potentially his entire career. Instead of immediately returning to his post as ordered, he remained beside Harold and addressed his commanding officer with respectful but firm conviction. "Sir, I request permission to escort this veteran to the medical facility and ensure his proper care during the ceremony." Captain Morrison's face darkened at Thomas's unexpected request. The gathering crowd of ceremony guests and media representatives made the situation even more delicate, as any public disagreement between royal guards would reflect poorly on the entire unit. The captain understood that his response would be witnessed by many people, including high-ranking officials who expected the Royal Guard to maintain absolute discipline and professionalism at all times. "Anderson, this is not a request you are authorized to make," Captain Morrison said in a low, controlled voice. "Return to your post immediately. That is a direct order." The captain's military bearing was imposing, and his words carried the weight of decades of command experience. Most guards would have immediately complied without further discussion, understanding that disobedience could result in serious disciplinary action. Thomas felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His entire career with the Royal Guard hung in the balance, and he knew that defying a direct order from his commanding officer could result in his dismissal from the elite unit. The position meant everything to him, representing not only personal achievement but also the fulfillment of a family tradition that stretched back generations. Harold, despite his pain and vulnerability, sensed the conflict playing out above him. He understood military hierarchy and the importance of following orders. Having spent decades both giving and receiving commands in various challenging situations, the last thing he wanted was for his accident to cause problems for the young guard who had shown him such unexpected kindness and respect. "Please," Harold said weakly, trying to address both men, "don't let my clumsiness cause any trouble. I'll be fine with the medical team." His words were meant to release Thomas from any obligation, but they had the opposite effect. The veteran's selfless concern for Thomas's welfare, even while injured and vulnerable, only strengthened the guard's resolve to do what he believed was right. The medical team had reached the scene and was preparing to transfer Harold to a stretcher. Their movements were efficient and professional, but Thomas noticed they seemed rushed, likely wanting to clear the ceremonial area as quickly as possible to allow the day's events to proceed on schedule. The thought of Harold being treated as merely an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a distinguished veteran deserving of honor, troubled Thomas deeply. Thomas made eye contact with Harold one more time, seeing not just an injured elderly man, but a representation of all the veterans who had sacrificed for their country's freedom and security. In that moment, Thomas realized that his duty extended beyond following orders to encompassing the values that the Royal Guard was meant to represent: honor, courage, and service to others. "Sir," Thomas addressed Captain Morrison with quiet determination, "I understand the consequences of my actions, but I cannot in good conscience abandon this veteran at this moment. He has given 50 years of his life in service to our country, and he deserves better than to be treated as an obstacle to our ceremony schedule." The words hung in the air like a challenge, not just to Captain Morrison's authority, but to the entire system of rigid protocol that governed the Royal Guard. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Royal Guards simply did not disobey direct orders, especially not in public view during important ceremonial events. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened as he processed the magnitude of Thomas's defiance. In his 25 years of military service, he had rarely encountered such blatant disregard for the chain of command. Part of him admired Thomas's conviction, but his responsibility as a commanding officer required him to maintain discipline and order within the ranks. "Guard Anderson," the captain said formally, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Remove your ceremonial insignia and report to my office after this event concludes." The pronouncement was devastating, effectively ending Thomas's career with the Royal Guard in front of hundreds of witnesses. Thomas felt a surge of loss and regret as he processed the captain's words. The Royal Guard position had been his dream job, representing the pinnacle of military service and tradition. His family would be devastated by the news, and his future career prospects would be significantly impacted by his dismissal from such a prestigious unit. However, as Thomas looked down at Harold, he felt no regret about his decision. The elderly veteran's eyes showed deep appreciation, mixed with concern for the sacrifice Thomas was making on his behalf. Harold had spent enough time in leadership positions to understand the courage it took to choose principle over personal advancement. Despite being relieved of duty, Thomas made no move to leave Harold's side. Instead, he helped the medical team carefully transfer the veteran to the stretcher, ensuring that Harold's dignity was maintained throughout the process. Thomas retrieved Harold's scattered medals from the palace steps, gently cleaning the dust from each one before placing them safely in Harold's jacket pocket. "Thank you, son," Harold whispered as he was being secured to the stretcher. "Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." The words carried deep meaning, acknowledging not just Thomas's actions in this moment, but his character as a person who was willing to sacrifice personal gain for the welfare of others. The crowd watched in fascination as Thomas walked alongside the stretcher as it was wheeled toward the palace medical facility. His actions had created a ripple effect throughout the ceremony attendees, with many people discussing the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. Some criticized Thomas for his disrespect of authority, while others praised his compassion and moral courage. Palace officials were clearly uncomfortable with the disruption to their carefully planned event. The ceremony was meant to proceed with clockwork precision, honoring veterans in a formal, dignified manner that reflected the solemnity of their service. Thomas's actions had introduced an element of unpredictability that challenged the established order and protocol. As they moved through the palace corridors, Thomas continued to stay close to Harold, despite no longer having any official authority or responsibility to do so. The medical team seemed uncertain about whether to allow Thomas to accompany them, but his quiet determination and obvious concern for Harold's welfare persuaded them to permit his presence. Harold drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, the pain from his injuries and the stress of the situation taking their toll on his 72-year-old body. Each time he opened his eyes, he saw Thomas walking beside him, a reassuring presence that provided comfort during a frightening and vulnerable time. When they reached the palace medical facility, doctors immediately began examining Harold to determine the extent of his injuries. X-rays revealed a fractured hip and shoulder injuries that would require surgery and extensive rehabilitation. The fall had been more serious than initially apparent, and Harold would face a long recovery period that might prevent him from living independently. Thomas remained in the waiting area, still wearing his Royal Guard uniform, minus the ceremonial insignia that Captain Morrison had ordered him to remove. He felt strange being in the palace in an unofficial capacity, no longer bound by the strict protocols that had governed his every action for the past 3 years. The freedom was both liberating and unsettling, representing a complete change in his identity and purpose. News of Thomas's actions spread quickly throughout the palace and beyond. Social media posts from ceremony attendees began circulating, showing photos and videos of the Royal Guard who had chosen compassion over protocol. The story captured public attention in a way that surprised everyone involved, resonating with people who appreciated seeing humanity triumph over rigid bureaucracy. Television news crews, initially present to cover the veterans' ceremony, found themselves with a much more compelling story than they had anticipated. The image of Thomas walking beside Harold's stretcher, his ceremonial jacket draped over the injured veteran, became symbolic of something larger than a simple act of kindness. It represented the conflict between institutional rules and individual conscience. Harold underwent emergency surgery to repair his fractured hip, with doctors expressing cautious optimism about his recovery prospects. His age and overall health would make rehabilitation challenging, but the medical team was impressed by his determination and fighting spirit. Thomas remained at the hospital throughout the surgery, despite having no official reason to be there and no family connection to Harold. Meanwhile, Captain Morrison faced increasing pressure from palace officials who were concerned about the media attention surrounding the incident. The Royal Guard was meant to be seen as a symbol of unwavering discipline and tradition, not as individuals who made independent decisions based on personal judgment. The captain found himself defending Thomas's character, while simultaneously maintaining that his actions were unacceptable within the military structure. The veteran ceremony continued as planned, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered by the morning's events. Many attendees found themselves distracted by what they had witnessed, with conversations repeatedly returning to Thomas's choice to prioritize Harold's dignity over his own career prospects. Some veterans expressed admiration for Thomas's actions, seeing them as embodying the true spirit of military service. Thomas received a phone call from his parents, who had seen the news coverage and were struggling to understand their son's decision. His father, a career military officer himself, was torn between pride in Thomas's compassion and concern about his future career prospects. His mother was primarily worried about the personal consequences Thomas would face for his actions. "I raised you to do the right thing," his mother said during their emotional conversation, "but I never wanted it to cost you everything you've worked for." Thomas tried to reassure his parents that he had no regrets about his decision, but he couldn't deny the uncertainty he felt about his future. The Royal Guard position had been his primary career goal, and losing it left him without a clear path forward. Social media reaction to the story was overwhelmingly positive, with thousands of people sharing posts praising Thomas's humanity and courage. Many users criticized the rigid military structure that punished acts of compassion, while others defended the importance of maintaining discipline and order within elite units. The debate highlighted broader questions about the balance between institutional authority and individual moral judgment. Harold regained consciousness after surgery to find Thomas sitting beside his hospital bed. The young man looked tired and worried, still wearing his Royal Guard uniform despite no longer being officially part of the unit. Harold's first concern was not for his own condition, but for the sacrifice Thomas had made on his behalf. "You didn't have to give up your career for me," Harold said weakly, his voice hoarse from the anesthesia. "I've lived my life and made my contribution. You're just getting started with yours." The veteran's selfless perspective touched Thomas deeply, reinforcing his belief that he had made the right choice despite the personal cost. Thomas explained to Harold that he had received dozens of phone calls and messages from people who had been inspired by his actions. Job offers from private security firms and veteran support organizations were already coming in, suggesting that his future might not be as bleak as initially feared. However, none of these opportunities carried the prestige and tradition of the Royal Guard position he had lost. Hospital staff were amazed by Thomas's dedication to Harold's welfare. Nurses reported that the young man had barely left the veteran's side, helping with everything from meal assistance to physical therapy encouragement. His presence seemed to accelerate Harold's recovery, providing emotional support that complemented the medical treatment he was receiving. The story gained international attention when a video of Thomas's actions was shared by major news networks. Military personnel from around the world commented on the incident, with many expressing support for Thomas's decision while acknowledging the difficult position he had been placed in. The debate extended beyond military circles to broader discussions about moral courage and institutional responsibility. Palace officials found themselves in an uncomfortable position as public opinion increasingly favored Thomas's actions over the military's response. Criticism mounted regarding the harsh treatment of someone who had simply shown compassion to an injured veteran. The negative publicity was exactly what the palace had hoped to avoid when maintaining strict protocols for ceremonial events. Harold's family, who lived in distant parts of the country, began arriving at the hospital to support him during his recovery. They were surprised and grateful to discover that Thomas had been caring for their elderly relative with such dedication. Harold's daughter, Margaret, was particularly moved by Thomas's sacrifice and began advocating publicly for his reinstatement to the Royal Guard. Thomas's former colleagues in the Royal Guard were divided in their opinions about his actions. Some admired his courage and believed he had upheld the true values of military service, while others felt he had undermined the discipline and order that made their unit effective. The division created tension within the ranks that Captain Morrison struggled to manage. Media interviews with Thomas revealed a thoughtful young man who was clearly conflicted about the consequences of his actions but remained convinced that he had made the right choice. His articulate explanations of his decision-making process impressed viewers and further increased public support for his position. Thomas emphasized that he had tremendous respect for military discipline but believed that compassion and human dignity were equally important values. The hospital became an unexpected gathering place for supporters who wanted to meet both Thomas and Harold. Veterans from multiple conflicts came to pay their respects to Harold and express appreciation for Thomas's actions. The visits created a sense of community and shared purpose that both men found deeply meaningful during a difficult time. Harold's recovery progressed more quickly than doctors had expected, partly due to the emotional support he received from Thomas and the numerous visitors who came to see him. Physical therapists noted that Harold seemed more motivated and determined than typical patients his age, possibly inspired by the attention his situation had received and the knowledge that his experience had sparked important conversations about values and priorities. Thomas began receiving speaking invitations from veteran organizations, schools, and community groups who wanted to hear about his experience and the decision-making process that led to his actions. These opportunities suggested that his career might take a different direction than originally planned, possibly focusing on veteran advocacy and support rather than traditional military service. The ongoing media attention created pressure on palace officials to reconsider their handling of the situation. Public relations experts advised that the negative publicity surrounding Thomas's dismissal was overshadowing the positive aspects of the veteran's ceremony and damaging the Royal Guard's reputation. Discussions began about possible ways to address the situation while maintaining institutional integrity. The royal family had been following the unfolding story with considerable interest and concern. The Queen's private secretary had briefed her on the situation, explaining how a simple act of compassion had escalated into a national conversation about military values and institutional flexibility. The Queen, known for her deep respect for military service and veterans, requested a full report on both Thomas Anderson and Harold Mitchell. Palace advisors were divided on how to respond to the mounting public pressure regarding Thomas's dismissal. Conservative voices argued that maintaining strict discipline was essential for the Royal Guard's effectiveness and reputation. However, others pointed out that the negative publicity was damaging the monarchy's image and undermining public support for traditional institutions. 3 days after Harold's surgery, an unexpected visitor arrived at the hospital. The Queen's private secretary, accompanied by a small security detail, requested a private meeting with both Harold and Thomas. The visit was kept secret from the media, as the royal family wanted to assess the situation personally before making any public statements or decisions. Harold was deeply moved by the royal visit, despite his physical discomfort from the surgery and ongoing recovery. Having served his country for 50 years, meeting a member of the royal family represented the culmination of a lifetime of dedication and service. Thomas was nervous but honored by the opportunity to explain his actions directly to someone who understood the importance of duty and tradition. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Richard Wellington, was a distinguished gentleman who had served the royal family for over 20 years. He had witnessed numerous challenging situations and was skilled at finding diplomatic solutions to complex problems. His visit to Harold and Thomas was part of a careful assessment of how the royal family should respond to the growing controversy. During their private conversation, Harold spoke eloquently about Thomas's character and the moral courage he had demonstrated. The veteran emphasized that Thomas had not acted out of disrespect for authority, but rather from a deep understanding of the values that military service was meant to represent. Harold's perspective carried significant weight, given his decades of distinguished service and obvious integrity. Thomas explained his decision-making process to Sir Richard, acknowledging that he had known the potential consequences of his actions, but felt compelled to prioritize Harold's dignity and welfare. He expressed no bitterness about his dismissal, understanding that military discipline required consequences for disobedience. However, he remained convinced that his actions had been morally justified. Sir Richard was impressed by both men's character and the respectful way they discussed the difficult situation. Harold's lack of bitterness despite his injuries and Thomas's acceptance of responsibility for his choices demonstrated the kind of integrity that the royal family valued highly. The secretary could see why the story had resonated so strongly with the public. Following the hospital visit, Sir Richard returned to the palace to brief the Queen on his findings. His report painted a picture of two exceptional individuals whose story highlighted the tension between institutional rules and individual conscience. The Queen listened carefully to his assessment, asking detailed questions about both men's backgrounds and motivations. The Queen's decision to personally intervene in the situation surprised even her closest advisors. Royal involvement in military disciplinary matters was rare and could set precedents that might complicate future situations. However, the Queen felt that the circumstances were exceptional and that the values demonstrated by both Harold and Thomas deserved recognition rather than punishment. The royal family's response came in the form of an unprecedented personal letter from the Queen to Thomas Anderson. The letter, which was later made public with Thomas's permission, praised his compassion and moral courage while acknowledging the difficult position he had been placed in. The Queen expressed her hope that the Royal Guard could find a way to recognize valuable character traits while maintaining necessary discipline. The letter had an immediate impact on public opinion and palace officials. Coming directly from the Queen, it represented a strong endorsement of Thomas's actions and an implicit criticism of the harsh response he had received. Captain Morrison and other military leaders found themselves under intense pressure to reconsider their handling of the situation. Harold received his own letter from the Queen, expressing admiration for his 50 years of military service and apologizing for the circumstances that had led to his injury at the palace. The Queen's personal attention to his situation meant more to Harold than any medal or commendation he had ever received, representing acknowledgement of his lifelong dedication from the highest levels of the country he had served. Media coverage of the Queen's intervention transformed the story, from a simple disciplinary matter into a broader discussion about leadership, compassion, and institutional flexibility. Editorial writers praised the Queen's wisdom in recognizing exceptional circumstances that required exceptional responses. The royal family's reputation was enhanced rather than damaged by their involvement in the controversial situation. Thomas received hundreds of additional letters and messages following the Queen's public support. Veterans organizations across the country expressed their appreciation for his actions and the Queen's recognition of their importance. Many writers shared their own experiences of times when military personnel had shown exceptional compassion and humanity beyond the call of duty. The pressure on Captain Morrison became overwhelming as criticism of his handling of the situation intensified. Fellow officers began questioning whether the punishment had been appropriate, given the circumstances and the public reaction. The captain found himself defending not just his decision, but the entire military culture that prioritized obedience over individual judgment. Palace officials worked behind the scenes to find a solution that would satisfy public opinion while maintaining institutional integrity. The challenge was to acknowledge Thomas's positive qualities without completely undermining military discipline and the authority of commanding officers. Various proposals were discussed, ranging from Thomas's reinstatement to alternative forms of recognition for his service. Harold's recovery continued to progress well, aided by the emotional boost he received from the Queen's letter and the ongoing support from Thomas and numerous visitors. Physical therapists noted that his motivation and determination exceeded expectations for someone his age, possibly inspired by the knowledge that his experience had led to important recognition of military values. Thomas found himself in the unusual position of being unemployed but constantly busy with speaking engagements, interviews, and meetings with veteran advocacy groups. The opportunities arising from his dismissal were beginning to suggest that his career might take a more meaningful direction than he had originally planned, focusing on supporting other veterans and promoting the values he had demonstrated. The veterans' ceremony that had been overshadowed by the incident was eventually rescheduled, with organizers expressing hope that Harold would be able to attend once his recovery was complete. The new ceremony was planned to specifically recognize both traditional military service and the kind of moral courage that Thomas had demonstrated, bridging the gap between institutional duty and individual conscience. Hospital staff noticed that the relationship between Harold and Thomas had evolved into something resembling a grandfather-grandson bond. Their shared experience had created a connection that transcended their original circumstances, with both men finding meaning and purpose in their unlikely friendship. The sight of the elderly, veteran and young former guard supporting each other through their respective challenges inspired everyone who witnessed their interactions. The Queen's intervention had fundamentally changed the trajectory of the story, transforming it from a cautionary tale about military discipline into an inspiring example of moral courage being recognized and rewarded. The royal endorsement provided legitimacy for Thomas's actions and created momentum for broader discussions about how institutions could better balance rules with human compassion. The unprecedented royal intervention created a domino effect throughout the military hierarchy. Senior officers who had initially supported Captain Morrison's decision began privately questioning whether the punishment had been too severe. The Queen's letter had essentially reframed Thomas's actions from insubordination to moral courage, making it difficult for military leaders to maintain their original position without appearing callous to veteran welfare. Captain Morrison requested a private meeting with Thomas at the hospital, away from media attention and public scrutiny. The encounter was tense initially, as both men understood that their professional relationship had been fundamentally altered by recent events. The captain had built his career on strict adherence to military protocol, while Thomas had demonstrated that sometimes higher principles required deviation from established rules. During their conversation, Captain Morrison surprised Thomas by expressing genuine respect for his character and motivations. The captain acknowledged that Thomas's actions had highlighted important questions about the balance between military discipline and humanitarian values. While he couldn't publicly reverse his decision without undermining his authority, the captain privately admitted that Thomas had faced an impossible choice with dignity and integrity, Harold. had been following the developments closely and used his influence as a decorated veteran to advocate for Thomas's reinstatement. He contacted former colleagues who now held senior positions in military leadership, sharing his perspective on Thomas's character and the circumstances that had led to his dismissal. These conversations carried significant weight, as Harold's reputation for integrity and judgment was well established throughout the military community. The media attention surrounding the story began to attract the interest of documentary filmmakers and authors who recognized the broader significance of the events. The story represented timeless themes of moral courage, institutional authority, and the tension between rules and compassion that resonated across different cultures and societies. Thomas and Harold found themselves at the center of discussions about military values and leadership that extended far beyond their personal situation. Thomas received an unexpected phone call from the Secretary of Defense, who had been briefed on the situation by senior military advisors. The conversation was formal but respectful, with the Secretary expressing appreciation for Thomas's service and character, while acknowledging the complex issues raised by his actions. The call suggested that high-level discussions were taking place about how to resolve the situation appropriately. Meanwhile, Harold's physical recovery continued steadily, though doctors warned that he would likely need ongoing assistance with daily activities. The thought of losing his independence was difficult for someone who had spent decades leading others and taking care of himself. Thomas had become an essential source of support, helping Harold navigate not just his physical limitations but also the emotional challenges of adjusting to a new reality. The Royal Guard unit itself was experiencing internal tension as members debated the appropriateness of Thomas's dismissal. Younger guards, many of whom had served in combat situations, were generally more supportive of Thomas's actions, understanding the importance of moral courage in military service. Older, more traditional guards tended to emphasize the importance of maintaining discipline and following orders without question. Public support for Thomas continued to grow as more details about his background emerged. Interviews with former Army colleagues revealed a pattern of exceptional character and dedication to fellow service members. Stories emerged of Thomas going above and beyond his duties to help other soldiers, demonstrating that his actions with Harold were consistent with his overall approach to military service. Harold's daughter, Margaret, had become an unofficial spokesperson for both men, granting interviews and organizing support campaigns. Her articulate advocacy helped maintain public attention on the story, while keeping the focus on the positive values demonstrated by both Thomas and her father. Margaret's efforts were particularly effective because she could speak from personal experience about the impact Thomas's compassion had on their family. The postponed veterans ceremony was rescheduled with significant modifications to acknowledge the lessons learned from the original incident. Organizers announced that the new ceremony would specifically recognize not just traditional military valor, but also the kind of moral courage and humanitarian service that Thomas had demonstrated. The changes represented a broader evolution in how military service and values were understood and celebrated. Thomas received formal job offers from several prestigious organizations, including veteran advocacy groups, private security firms, and even international humanitarian organizations. The opportunities were more varied and potentially more meaningful than his original Royal Guard position, suggesting that his moral courage had opened doors he never could have imagined. However, Thomas remained conflicted about his future, feeling that his true calling might still lie in traditional military service. Hospital administrators were amazed by the transformation in Harold's recovery pace once he began receiving constant support from Thomas and the stream of visitors inspired by their story. Medical research had long established the importance of emotional support in healing, but the dramatic improvement in Harold's condition provided a powerful real-world example of how human connection could accelerate physical recovery. The Queen announced her intention to personally present awards to both Harold and Thomas at a special ceremony that would acknowledge their respective contributions to military values and humanitarian service. The announcement was unprecedented, as the Queen rarely created new awards or recognition ceremonies outside of established traditions. The decision demonstrated the royal family's commitment to supporting the values both men had exemplified. Captain Morrison faced increasing pressure from his superiors to find a face-saving solution that would address public criticism while maintaining military discipline. The captain understood that his own career was now linked to how successfully he could resolve the situation. Military leadership was quietly exploring options that would allow Thomas's reinstatement without completely undermining the authority of commanding officers. The story had begun to inspire similar acts of compassion within military units around the world. Soldiers reported feeling more confident about prioritizing humanitarian concerns when they conflicted with strict protocol, citing Thomas's example as proof that moral courage would ultimately be recognized and rewarded. Military psychologists noted that the story was having a positive impact on morale and ethical decision-making throughout various armed forces. Thomas spent his days dividing time between caring for Harold, participating in media interviews, and meeting with various organizations interested in his future services. The constant activity helped distract him from the uncertainty about his career prospects, but he remained deeply committed to Harold's welfare above all other considerations. Their friendship had become the most meaningful aspect of the entire experience for both men. Harold's medical team began planning his discharge from the hospital, though he would require extensive rehabilitation and ongoing support services. The prospect of leaving the protective environment of the hospital was both exciting and frightening for Harold, who had grown accustomed to the constant care and attention he had received. Thomas had already committed to helping Harold transition to whatever living arrangements would best support his continued recovery. Veterans, organizations across the country, organized fundraising campaigns to support both Harold's medical expenses and Thomas's transition to civilian employment. The campaigns were overwhelmingly successful, demonstrating the deep appreciation people felt for both men's sacrifices and the values they represented. The financial support removed practical concerns about their futures, allowing them to focus on recovery and new opportunities without economic stress. 6 weeks after the incident that had changed both their lives, Harold and Thomas found themselves preparing for the special ceremony the Queen had announced. Harold's recovery had progressed remarkably well, though he still required assistance with mobility and would need ongoing physical therapy. The prospect of meeting the Queen in person represented the pinnacle of recognition for his 50 years of military service, though he insisted that Thomas deserved equal acknowledgement for his sacrifice and compassion. The ceremony was planned to take place in the same palace where Harold had originally fallen, creating a symbolic circle that transformed a place of vulnerability and embarrassment into one of honor and recognition. Palace officials worked carefully to ensure that every detail of the event would reflect the dignity and significance of the occasion while avoiding any circumstances that might create additional challenges for Harold's limited mobility. Thomas had made a difficult decision about his future. During the weeks leading up to the ceremony, after extensive discussions with military leaders, veteran advocates, and his own family, he had chosen to accept a newly created position as Special Advisor for Veteran Affairs within the Royal Guard structure. The role would allow him to return to service while focusing specifically on ensuring that veteran welfare remained a priority in all military activities and ceremonies. The new position was unprecedented, representing a creative solution that satisfied multiple stakeholders while addressing the systemic issues that had led to the original conflict. Thomas would maintain his military rank and status while having specific authority to advocate for veteran concerns and humanitarian considerations in military planning and operations. The role effectively institutionalized the values he had demonstrated during Harold's crisis. Captain Morrison had worked closely with senior military leadership to develop Thomas's new position, recognizing that the situation had highlighted important gaps in how the military balanced protocol with humanitarian concerns. The captain's willingness to evolve his leadership approach and find creative solutions had ultimately enhanced rather than damaged his reputation, demonstrating the kind of adaptive leadership that modern military challenges required. Harold's daughter, Margaret, had taken a leave of absence from her job to help coordinate her father's care and transition to independent living with support services. The experience had brought their family closer together, while demonstrating the importance of community support for aging veterans. Margaret had become an advocate for veteran services in her own right, planning to continue this work even after her father's situation stabilized. On the day of the ceremony, Harold wore his full military dress uniform, with all 50 years' worth of medals and commendations properly displayed. Despite his physical limitations, he carried himself with the dignity and bearing that had characterized his entire military career. Thomas, wearing his restored Royal Guard uniform with new insignia reflecting his special advisor role, walked beside Harold as they approached the palace entrance together. The ceremony drew a distinguished audience, including senior military officers, veteran advocates, members of parliament, and representatives from veteran organizations throughout the country. Media coverage was extensive but respectful, focusing on the positive values being recognized rather than the controversy that had initially surrounded the incident. The atmosphere was one of celebration and reconciliation rather than conflict. The Queen's speech during the ceremony was brief but powerful, emphasizing the importance of maintaining institutional discipline while never losing sight of the humanitarian values that military service was meant to protect. She spoke about the courage required to make difficult moral decisions and the importance of supporting those who demonstrated such courage, even when it challenged established protocols. Harold received the newly created Medal for Distinguished Lifetime Service, recognizing not just his 50 years of military service, but also his grace and dignity in handling the difficult circumstances of his accident and recovery. The medal came with a modest pension supplement that would help ensure his financial security during his retirement years, removing concerns about his ability to afford necessary care and support services. Thomas was awarded the Medal for Exceptional Moral Courage, a new recognition specifically created to acknowledge service members who demonstrated extraordinary humanitarian values while maintaining their commitment to military excellence. The award came with his promotion to a senior advisory role and a mandate to help develop training programs that would better prepare military personnel to handle similar ethical challenges in the future. The ceremony concluded with Harold and Thomas being invited to a private reception with the Queen and other members of the royal family. During their conversation, the Queen expressed her personal appreciation for both men's character and her hope that their example would inspire others to demonstrate similar courage and compassion when faced with difficult choices between institutional requirements and humanitarian concerns. Following the ceremony, Harold moved into a specially adapted apartment near the military hospital, where he could receive ongoing medical care while maintaining his independence with appropriate support services. Thomas visited regularly, and their friendship continued to provide mutual support and companionship. The apartment became a gathering place for other veterans, who found inspiration in Harold's resilience and Thomas's example of moral courage. Thomas's new role as special advisor for veteran affairs evolved into a comprehensive program that revolutionized how the military approached veteran services and humanitarian concerns. His work included developing new protocols for ceremonial events that prioritized veteran dignity and welfare, creating support systems for aging veterans attending official functions, and training programs for military personnel on balancing protocol with compassionate service. The story of Harold and Thomas became a case study taught in military leadership courses, demonstrating the importance of moral courage and the positive outcomes that could result from prioritizing humanitarian values alongside institutional discipline. Military academies around the world incorporated their example into ethics training, helping prepare future officers to handle similar challenges with wisdom and integrity. Harold's health continued to improve steadily, aided by regular physical therapy, strong family support, and the ongoing friendship with Thomas that provided emotional strength and motivation. He began speaking at veteran events and military ceremonies, sharing his perspective on the importance of supporting fellow service members and recognizing the humanitarian aspects of military service that sometimes transcended formal protocols. The veterans ceremony that had been postponed was finally held 6 months later, with both Harold and Thomas participating as honored guests. The event had been redesigned to better accommodate elderly veterans and include specific recognition for those who demonstrated exceptional compassion and moral courage in their service. The ceremony became a model for similar events throughout the country. Thomas and Harold's story continued to inspire acts of compassion and moral courage throughout the military and veteran communities. Their example demonstrated that doing the right thing, even when it required personal sacrifice, could ultimately lead to positive changes that benefited many others. The institutional changes that resulted from their experience created lasting improvements in how military organizations balanced discipline with humanitarian values. Years later, as Harold celebrated his 80th birthday surrounded by family, friends, and fellow veterans, he reflected on how a moment of vulnerability and physical weakness had ultimately led to one of the most meaningful friendships and recognitions of his life. Thomas, now married with children of his own, continued his work advocating for veteran welfare while maintaining his military service in his expanded role. The palace steps where Harold had fallen were eventually marked with a small plaque, acknowledging the site where moral courage had triumphed over institutional rigidity. The inscription read simply, "In recognition of the courage to choose compassion over protocol," serving as a reminder to all who passed that true strength sometimes required the willingness to break rules in service of higher values. Their story became a testament to the power of individual moral courage to create positive institutional change, demonstrating that one person's willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for the welfare of others could inspire broader transformations that benefited entire communities. The friendship between Harold and Thomas endured as a symbol of the bonds that could form when people chose to prioritize human dignity above all other considerations.